Things now gone forever, 1920s to 1970s. Ever wondered why you don't see people walking around with Zoot suits or riding penny farthings? Well, we've got answers and a whole lot of nostalgia. So here are some things you may remember from the 1920s to the 1970s that are now gone forever. Number 30, airships. It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's a comically giant balloon-like structure strangely hovering above us as if stuck in one place. During their heyday, in the first decades of the 20th century, these lighter-than-air vessels were both a luxurious passenger service and military-grade weapon. But then came the Hindenburg, a fiery reminder that maybe filling a giant balloon with flammable hydrogen wasn't the best idea after all. Who knew? And just like that, the golden age of airships went up in smoke. Literally. Airships are highly susceptible to strong winds, storms, and other adverse weather conditions. They are slower than airplanes, making them less reliable in terms of maintaining schedules. Thus, vulnerability limits their practicality for regular transportation. So, unless you've got a serious nostalgia for floating cruise ships, or you need to lift something too big for a helicopter, airships are basically the sky's answer to a flip phone. Cool in theory, but totally outclassed by modern tech. Number 29. Vacuum-powered radios. Back in the 1970s, every car would have one of these vacuum tube radios installed, and if you were unfortunate enough to leave one running overnight, you'd have a dead battery when you came back. Radios were sold as 1, 2, or 3 vacuum tubes. The really good radios had 3.
Thankfully, no harm was done to the battery contacts. I don't know who would be thoughtful enough to package this all neatly back into the original box and leave old batteries in it, but...
Vacuum tube radios were among the first commercially available radios, making them revolutionary at the time. They brought news, music, and entertainment directly into people's homes, which was a huge leap forward in communication technology. One of the reasons they went out of fashion was simply because you can't carry one in your pocket like modern technology. Vacuum tubes are large, fragile, and require a lot of power to operate. As technology advanced, the development of transistors in the 1950s and 1960s made it possible to build much smaller, more efficient, and more reliable radios. Transistors could do the same job as vacuum tubes, but were tiny, robust, and required far less power. Number 28. Public spittoons. Only a century and a half ago, things were very different in America. If you go to a museum or a restored shop, you'll find lots of mysterious objects. One of the strangest artifacts you might see is a small copper or earthenware basin on the floor. Some of these are chamber pots, but the brass ones are spittoons. During the 1800s and early 1900s, chewing tobacco was incredibly popular, especially in the United States. Spitting was a natural byproduct of this habit, as users needed a place to dispose of their saliva mixed with tobacco. When a spittoon was full of smelly yellow-brown spit, some unfortunate person would have to take it outside to empty it. Whew! We're glad they're not around anymore. Number 27. Cigarette advertising. This 1890s ad from Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes warns against administering them to your kids unless they're at least 6 years old, because even 10-year-olds deserve a puff of that good old death stick, right? Cigarette advertising was once a powerful force in marketing, deeply embedded in popular culture, and widely seen across all forms of media. From the early 20th century to the 1970s, cigarette ads were everywhere. However, over time, growing awareness of the health risks associated with smoking led to stricter regulations and eventually the near-complete ban of cigarette advertising. That's why we won't see cigarette advertising like this advertisement from the 1920s that shows a literal child light up a cigarette in the presence of his parents. Number 26. Brownie camera. Brownie camera was introduced by Kodak way back in 1900. Back when the world was in glorious sepia tone. This simple box made of cardboard brought photography to the hands of the common man. For just $1, which, let's be real, was the price of a small farm back then, You could buy yourself a boxy little camera made of cardboard and take photos of whatever people photographed before there were cat memes, right? The Brownie was incredibly easy to use, with just a few simple controls.
So we should be able to shoot with it. So I have a roll here from a past roll of film that I put into a 620 camera. This is a 120.
You didn't need to be a professional to take a photo. Just point the camera and press the shutter. Number 25, automats. Have you ever been made to wait hours for food just because a restaurant was understaffed or the waiter was just straight up lazy? Automats fixed all of these problems, but have since then disappeared from the limelight. It all sounds so futuristic. A restaurant without waiters, workers behind the counter, or any visible employees, where you simply fed your money into a glass-enclosed kiosk, removed a steaming plate of freshly made food, and carried it to your table. It had little glass windows framed in brass with knobs, and if you put 2 nickels into slots next to the windows, they would open up and you could take out a piece of lemon meringue pie, meatloaf, or mashed potatoes for 10 cents. The rise of fast food chains in the 1960s, such as McDonald's and Burger King, began to eclipse the automats. These new restaurants offered drive-through services, which catered to the growing car culture in America, something automats couldn't compete with. Number 24, quill pens. Quill pens have always looked majestic and classy, but when it came to writing with them, we'll choose to stick with the trusty old fountain pens. Made from the flight feathers of large birds like geese, quill pens were used from the 6th century until the 9th century. For every 10 minutes of writing, expect to spend 15 minutes sharpening though, and dipping it over and over again into the ink
is going to work well.
So I see the table's at a slant. Is there a reason for that?
Oh yes, it's very important for the delivery of ink because it puts the pen at a horizontal angle.
Was something that'd make you want to tear up whatever you were writing on. Modern pens are more portable and practical than quills. They are self-contained, with ink either stored in cartridges or as part of the pen itself, eliminating the need for an inkwell. This makes them far more convenient for everyday use, especially for those on the go. But hey, let's give credit where credit's due. The quill pen had its moment. It gave us Shakespeare, the Declaration of Independence, and probably a ton of medieval grocery lists. Number 23, kerosene lamps. Do you remember kerosene lamps? Many of you may even have them stored away in an attic still, gathering dust and waiting for the next power outage so they can come to the rescue again and fight away the darkness. Kerosene lamps became popular in the mid-19th century as a practical and relatively affordable lighting solution. Before their introduction, people relied on oil lamps or whale oil lamps, which were either less efficient or more expensive. So, while kerosene lamps were great in their day, like really great if you were into inhaling fumes and dodging fiery deaths, we're probably not going to see them making a comeback anytime soon. Unless, of course, you're going for that vintage but also very flammable aesthetic. Number 22, horse-drawn milk wagons. Back before huge milk corporations took over, milk was delivered by small local milk businesses. They began as an almost single-person operation.
If he whistled or whatever, he would bring the wagon down to where they were. When they had their own truck, why then they'd go behind the...
With milk being delivered straight from the farm to the local houses. Milk would be delivered to homes using horse-drawn wagons. Many can still remember hearing the clip-clop of the hooves and running outside with their milk jugs. The clatter of hooves and the sound of glass bottles clinking became part of the morning routine in many neighborhoods. However, the advent of home refrigeration in the mid-20th century changed everything. People no longer needed daily deliveries of milk since they could store it for longer periods. This made the daily milk run obsolete and significantly reduced the need for milkmen and their horse-drawn wagons. Number 21, cigarette cards. Cigarette cards were the original Pokemon cards, but we wouldn't suggest catching them all, unless you want the added risk of lung cancer as well. Cigarette cards are small pieces of rectangular cards, which used to be inserted into cigarette packets between the late 1800s and early 1900s. While in the beginning they used to stiffen cigarette boxes, these unassuming objects quickly became an ingenious advertising gimmick used by tobacco companies to popularize pre-rolled cigarettes, which dominate the market to this day. The way companies market their products has changed drastically since the heyday of cigarette cards. Modern marketing relies heavily on digital media, social platforms, and targeted advertising, none of which would benefit from physical collectibles like cards. Number 20. Walkman. Whether it was walking to school, downtown for coffee, a long ride in the car with your folks, you always had that Walkman. These days, getting access to music is almost an afterthought. You just take your phone out of your pocket and boom! Back then, having ready access to music was something that required some planning. It required picking out what tapes you wanted to have on you, and often contained a small handful of mixtapes, because sometimes you needed variety. Mixtapes are the original shuffle. You had to do it yourself. Number 19. Penny newspapers. Before the penny press, newspapers were typically expensive and targeted at the wealthy. The high cost limited their readership to the elite. Penny newspapers broke this barrier by offering news at a price that almost anyone could afford. Imagine getting a whole newspaper for just a penny. When was the last time you even saw a penny? But why don't we see penny newspapers anymore? Well, for one thing, who's got time to wait for tomorrow's news? We're living in the age of instant gratification, baby. If it didn't happen 5 minutes ago, it might as well be ancient history. Number 18. Radio dramas. Remember radio dramas? A strange combination of modern-day podcasts and TV shows. These audio-only productions, which flourished from the 1920s to the 1950s, transported audiences to different worlds.
Evening, Susan.
Hello.
She was giving me the creeps, Colonel. Seeing cottage loaves where there weren't any.
Using nothing more than voices, music, and sound effects. Yes, before Netflix binges and HBO maxing out your credit card, people got their drama fixed by listening to the radio. That's right, just listening. And no, not in a true crime podcast while doing dishes kind of way. We're talking about full-on, edge-of-your-seat, did the butler do it kind of drama. This was peak entertainment, folks. However, as time progressed and visual media took over, with television taking over our living rooms, radio dramas soon faded into the background of the media industry. Number 17. Automobile rumble seats. Back in the days before seatbelts, this was a mother-in-law trébuquette. Rumble seats, also known as mother-in-law seats, were a unique feature found in some early automobiles, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s. These were extra seats located in the trunk of the car, which could be flipped open to accommodate 1 or 2 passengers. And if you were lucky enough to snag a ride in the rumble seat, you were in for the ultimate open-air experience, or as we call it today, a hold-on-for-dear-life simulator. Rumble seats offered little to no protection for passengers. There were no seat belts, no roll bars, and no cover from the elements or road debris. In the event of an accident, passengers in the rumble seat were highly vulnerable.
Pulling in, it was like, wow, man, just fascinating.
Yeah. So you started with a 57
Yes.
Chev? You still have that?
Yes, I do. It's a 4-door hardtop.
As automobile safety standards had evolved, the rumble seat became an obvious liability. Number 16. Handwritten letters. There's something truly special about receiving a handwritten letter. It feels like a piece of someone's heart and soul has been carefully crafted into words on paper. Sadly, over the years, a simple handwritten letter has been moved from an everyday practice to a unique way to communicate. In a world of instant messaging, texting, and email, you may wonder if handwritten letters are relevant or if they have a place in the modern world. A handwritten letter carries the unique touch of the writer, literally. The choice of paper, the ink, the handwriting style, and even the occasional smudge or crossout all contribute to the letter's personality. Despite their decline, handwritten letters still hold a certain nostalgic appeal. They are often associated with romance, history, and a sense of timelessness. Number 15. Phone books. Remember the days that your new, crisp, fresh-smelling phone book would arrive at your doorstep, all shiny and new? Usually in a house, there would be one white and one yellow for residential and commercial phone numbers. The old ones wouldn't be thrown out but recycled, often used by kids as cushions to prop themselves up in seats or stand up on to reach places they weren't tall enough for. Well, long gone are those days. These days, you're more likely to see phone books outside the house than in them.
And we turned on our favorite 4-pound directory.
It's just a waste of paper, and obviously no one's taking them. They're just cluttering up the front of our building.
Remarkably, phone books have been around for 100 years, and at one point were the most oft-read book in many houses. That's because even if you didn't read a word of literature, a romance novel, or even a comic book, you sure as heck looked up the phone number of a plumber when the toilet started to gurgle. Number 14, physical encyclopedia. Physical encyclopedias, once the crown jewels of household bookshelves, were massive, multi-volume collections of knowledge covering everything from aardvarks to Zoroastrianism. For generations, they were the go-to sources for students, scholars, and curious minds who needed reliable information in a pre-internet world. Back then, finding information meant actually flipping pages. Can you imagine? Today, you just type into Google and boom, you're a genius in seconds. But in the days of the encyclopedia, you were one paper cut away from finally knowing how photosynthesis works. There was a certain joy in flipping through an encyclopedia and stumbling upon fascinating information accidentally. Physical encyclopedias were expensive, often costing hundreds or even thousands of dollars for a complete set. They also took up significant shelf space, making them impractical for many modern homes. Number 13, public bulletin boards. Once upon a time, this was the original Facebook wall. Except, it wasn't actually a wall.
So yeah, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here. You got this funny little code thing going on, and
instead of cat memes and political rants, you had flyers for yard sales and lost parrots. Public bulletin boards were once the heart of community communication. These simple, cork-covered surfaces were found in grocery stores, libraries, and coffee shops. They were the original social media, offering a place where anyone could pin a flyer, a business card, or a note about a lost cat. Whether you were looking for a babysitter, a local event, or a cheap couch, the bulletin board had you covered. Back then, real estate on these boards was prime. You couldn't just slap your flyer anywhere. You had to find the perfect spot, avoiding the weird guy who posted 47 different ads about his totally legit pyramid scheme. It was all about strategy, right next to the lost dog poster, or sandwiched between yoga classes and drum circle invites. However, the rise of the internet, social media, and apps like Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace has made public bulletin boards largely redundant. Now you can reach far more people with a single post online than you ever could with a paper flyer. Number 12, Zoot suits. With its supersized shoulder pads, sprawling lapels, and peg-leg pants, the Zoot suit grew out of the drape suits popular in Harlem dance halls in the mid-1930s. It was a symbol of cultural pride and defiance, especially among African American.
The sailors beat the Zoot suiters, tore their clothes, and stripped them to their underwear. The following day, more servicemen traveled to Watts,
Latino and Italian American communities. The bigger the suit, the bigger the attitude. The flowing trousers were tapered at the ankles to prevent jitterbugging couples from getting tripped up while they twirled. So why don't we see Zoot suits making a comeback? Well, aside from the fact that it's nearly impossible to fit one into your closet, fashion has moved on. It is ever evolving, and the exaggerated style of the Zoot suit no longer fits with modern trends, which favor more streamlined and minimalist designs. Number 11, dictaphones. If you were an executive or a foxy lawyer in the 1960s, chances are you'd always had a dictaphone on you at all times. The name dictaphone became synonymous with voice recorders, much like how Kleenex is often used for tissues. Before the widespread use of personal computers, dictaphones were the go-to device for recording spoken words. Users would speak into a microphone, and the machine would record their voice onto magnetic tapes, cylinders, or discs, depending on the era. Let's not forget the nightmare of transcribing from these things. If your recording was too quiet, too loud, or you mumbled your way through it, like a tired professor, well, good luck. you'd be spending the next hour replaying the same 3 seconds over and over again, trying to figure out if you just said memo or meow. The attorney would hand you a red record with a tape paper clip to it.
And you kind of notice that whenever you pause the music, it kind of fades away, which is a cool effect. So it's not too
The tab would have all the punches in it. A top punch meant the start of a new document, and the bottom punches were corrections. If you got to a bottom punch, you were supposed to listen for the correction before you typed anything. Apparently, there was no backup feature either. All we would hear is, "Correction! Number 10, penny farthing." Penny farthings were crazy dangerous. That's why when someone came up with the basic double diamond design still used today, they called it the safety bicycle. They were called that when they came out to advertise the fact that you wouldn't die from hitting a rock. The penny farthing, also known as the high wheel or ordinary bicycle, is one of the most iconic yet impractical bicycles in history. Now, let's talk about why the penny farthing was invented in the first place. You see, back then, the size of the front wheel determined how fast you could go. So, naturally, some genius thought, why not make the front wheel absurdly huge? And thus, the penny farthing was born. But there's a catch. The bigger the wheel, the higher you sit. And the higher you sit, the more spectacular your crash is when you inevitably hit a pebble or, a gentle breeze. Number 9, silent movies. Silent films had a lot of weight to carry. They had to tell us a story without dialogue. Sure, sometimes random cards would come up with words on them, but mostly these movies had to have stories that survived without any dialogue to solidify the story. They were the embodiment of the rule, show, don't tell. Silent film stars like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Greta Garbo became global icons. Their unique ability to communicate emotions and stories without dialogue made them beloved figures around the world. The silent film was kind of like that old flip phone you used to have. Cute and all, but we've moved on. Modern audiences are used to films with dialogue, sound effects, and music that amplifies the storytelling experience. The expectation for sound in films is now so ingrained that a silent movie would feel incomplete to most modern viewers. Number 8, pocket dictionaries. Remember when phones didn't have dictionaries, and you had to carry with yourself those pocket dictionaries thick enough to even stop bullets? Well, pocket dictionaries were small enough to fit in a bag or even a coat pocket, making them perfect for students, professionals, and travelers. Finding a word in these tiny books was like finding a needle in a haystack, with you squinting at tiny print and flipping through thousands of pages like you were scratching for buried treasure. These days, e-readers and digital libraries have further diminished the need for physical reference books. Many e-books and digital publications come with built-in dictionaries and instant search features, making physical pocket dictionaries less relevant. Number 7, hand-cranked cars. Can you imagine having to go out every day and hand-crank your vehicle? Well, just over 100 years ago, anyone who owned a vehicle had to hand-crank their vehicle. The hand crank was a metal rod that the driver had to insert into the front of the car.
And it wouldn't hurt either just to pull the choke out. Just so the idle is a bit higher. That might be a bit easier to start when it's cold.
And manually turn to get the engine running. But here's the thing. Hand cranks were dangerous. If you didn't have the technique down, or if your car was feeling a little sassy that day, that crank could kick back and bam! You've got a broken wrist or worse. It was like trying to tame a wild beast every time you wanted to go for a drive. Electric starters made it much easier and safer to start a car, and by the 1920s, they had become standard equipment in most automobiles. The electric starter made hand cranks obsolete almost overnight. Number 6, Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles were shanty towns that sprung up across the United States during the Great Depression of the 1930s. These makeshift communities were named after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the economic conditions that led to widespread poverty and homelessness. Tiny homes are all the rage today. Minimalist living, eco-friendly, super Instagrammable. But did you know that nearly a century ago we had a similar concept, only it was a lot less cozy? Today, cities have more advanced urban planning and housing policies in place. Even though homelessness is still a serious issue, the response to it is more structured and organized, with shelters, affordable housing programs, and other resources aimed at preventing the spread of makeshift communities like Hoovervilles.
Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon echoed the beliefs of most of Hoover's advisors.
While we won't see Hoovervilles in the same form as during the 1930s, the lessons they taught us continue to influence how we address issues of poverty, homelessness, and economic inequality today. Number 5. Steam-powered ships. Passenger steamships were the ultimate way to travel, if you didn't mind spending weeks on a floating coal furnace, that is. These bad boys were powered by steam engines, which, in case you didn't know, required an insane amount of coal. Imagine having a job where you just shovel coal into a furnace all day, every day. Steamships were not environmentally friendly, though, and they burned vast amounts of coal or wood, contributing to the air pollution and deforestation. In today's world, where there is an increasing awareness of environmental issues and a push for cleaner energy sources, the idea of bringing back coal-powered steamships is unthinkable. Number 4. Mangle machine. This medieval-looking contraption was once the pinnacle of laundry technology. You'd feed your soaking wet clothes into these rollers, and then, with all your might, crank the handle to squeeze out the water. It's like CrossFit, but with more screaming. A mangle machine typically consisted of 2 large rollers set in a frame. The wet clothes would be fed between the rollers, and as the handle was turned, the rollers would squeeze out excess water and flatten the fabric.
Because I have this.
And I guarantee you won't see something like this again anytime soon.
While primarily used for drying, mangles were also used for ironing large items like bed sheets, tablecloths, and curtains. Some more advanced models even had heating elements to aid in the ironing process. Mangle machines were bulky and took up a lot of space. In today's homes, where space is often at a premium, the idea of dedicating a large portion of your laundry room to a mangle is just, well, impractical. Today, you might find mangle machines in antique shops or museums, serving as a reminder of how much technology has improved our daily lives. Number 3. Canned rations. Canned rations have a long history, dating back to the early 19th century, when they were first introduced as a way to preserve food for military troops and explorers. These compact, durable, and long-lasting food supplies became staples during wars, expeditions, and emergency situations. Back in the day, these bad boys were a lifesaver. Whether you were in the trenches, exploring the Arctic, or just surviving another family camping trip, canned rations were there for you. Imagine eating a diet of canned goods for weeks on end. Your taste buds would revolt and start demanding actual vegetables, not the ones that look like they've been trapped in gelatin for a decade. Let's be honest, canned rations were never known for their flavor or nutritional value.
What? Oh, the smell just hit me. It smells bad.
Oh, the smell
smells really bad.
With a focus on convenience and longevity, taste often took a back seat. Modern consumers, including military personnel, expect better tasting, more nutritious meals, which today's technology can provide. Number 2. Trench warfare. First off, let's talk about what trench warfare was all about. Picture this. It's the early 20th century, and instead of dodging bullets with cool gadgets, soldiers are dodging rats, lice, and trench foot in a soggy ditch. Ah, the good old days of being stuck in a narrow pit of misery. Life in the trenches was harsh. Soldiers faced constant exposure to the elements, poor sanitation, disease, and the psychological strain of near-constant combat. Trench foot, lice, and rats were common problems. The trenches were often muddy, cramped, and infested with vermin. Major battles involving trench warfare included the Battle of the Somme, Verdun, and the Battle of the Marne. These battles are known for their staggering number of casualties and the seemingly unending stalemates. Number 1. Black and white TV. Having a black and white TV was the height of luxury. You could finally see moving pictures at home, and who cared if everything looked like it was filmed on a rainy day? But fast forward to today, and our TVs have more colors than a bag of Skittles. While black and white TVs hold a certain nostalgic charm for some.
Well, this one is flat, and the two CRTs you can see are slightly different colors. This one is more white.
They're mostly remembered as relics of a bygone era. People might enjoy watching classic black and white films or TV shows from time to time, but they do so on modern color TVs, often with the option to toggle between color and the original black and white. But for us, black and white TVs are history. When color TVs hit the scene, it was like Dorothy stepping into Oz. Everything was suddenly in Technicolor. And let's be honest, once you've seen television in color, going back to black and white is like trading in your smartphone for a rotary phone. So, these were some things from the 20th century that you will probably never see again, unless you're in a museum or the internet. If we've missed anything, let us know below in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.